So my breastfeeding story is complicated, but not in many ways. And it really played a really large part in my life. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about where it all began, which is when I was a little girl. So as a little girl, and I'm not going to read exactly as the slides say, but if anybody wants to read it from the slides, you absolutely can. I always knew that I was going to breastfeed my children. I would breastfeed my baby dolls as a little girl. And I remember one time that I was playing house in my bedroom and I was breastfeeding my baby doll. And my mom came in and I immediately stopped and hid what I was doing. And I had this sense of shame that what I was doing was wrong or grown, even though it felt right. It felt like I was just playing mom and this is what moms do. And my mom didn't catch on to what I was doing. I told her later when I grew up. But I think a lot of it had to do with my upbringing in a more religious household and not wanting to be perceived as grown, which a lot of Black girls tend to get that label if they do anything that could be interpreted in any other type of way. And so I did continue to nurse my baby dolls, but I just did it in hiding, and I, would make sure that my mom didn't see. And so I always tell people that I knew that I was going to breastfeed, even though I had never seen people breastfeed. I had one aunt who breastfed, and she was kind of ridiculed because she practiced extended breastfeeding. And so it was kind of the joke in the family because her daughter was a little older and she could come and get on her lap and say she wanted to breastfeed. And so outside of that, I never heard people talk about breastfeeding and I never saw people breastfeeding. It just was something that somehow I knew about and it just resonated with me that that's what I wanted to do. And so we can go to the next slide. So at 22, I became pregnant and this was my first pregnancy, my first child. And I had a really turbulent pregnancy. I had lots of issues going on personally with the father of my child. And I also had really, really, really bad sickness for about 7 months. And of course, some other pregnancy related ailments. But it was a tough time. And throughout that time, I don't think I ever questioned whether I would breastfeed or whether I could breastfeed. It just was something that I was going to do. I didn't even have this negative concept in my brain that there could be something that I couldn't do. And again, this was not something that I had any type of support with or someone telling me about it or things to do. So after giving birth, which I had to have an emergency C-section, I finally got to hold my son and it just felt like this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Like I'm supposed to be breastfeeding. And I didn't have any clue as to whether I was doing it wrong, whether I was doing it right. I just did what felt natural. And so I had a nurse on duty who was really, really supportive of me breastfeeding. When I told her that's what I wanted to do, she was cheering me on. She just kind of gave me some different ways to hold the baby. And it felt nice because she was the only person, even moving after giving birth, who helped me with breastfeeding or who really gave me a positive interaction about choosing to breastfeed. And there was an incident in the hospital where she kind of became my hero. I had an extended stay because I had preeclampsia and my blood pressure was so high that they didn't want to let me leave for almost a week. And so while in the hospital, my son's father wanted to make sure that the baby was getting enough milk. And he could not be sure because he couldn't see the milk that was being given to the baby because I was nursing. And so we got into an argument in the hospital, and it got kind of loud, and the nurse heard the commotion, and she came in the hospital room and she said, "Hey, what's going on?" And so he's like, "Hey, I want to feed the baby. I want to feed the baby formula." They have provided little formula bottles in the cart for the baby. And I let the nurse know that I wanted to exclusively breastfeed. I didn't even use that terminology because I was not aware of that terminology at that point. I just knew that I'm only giving my baby breast milk. The nurse sided with me. I I want to also add, I hid the breast milk. I mean, I hid the formula because I didn't want him to give the baby formula. And I knew that he would if he found the bottles. So I hid the formula in this little compartment in the cart. And the nurse not only had my back and stood up for me and said, "Hey, if mom only wants to give baby breast milk, then that's what we're going to do." And she kind of came in and helped to diffuse the situation, but also it helped to validate my feeling that I was doing the right thing. Because if this medical professional is saying, "We support mom in breastfeeding the baby, and we're going to stand by her, even if someone else is trying to give formula," I felt like they know what they're talking about. So if she's saying that this is okay, then we're gonna we're gonna be on the right path. So I always thank her because she was in that moment kind of this hero for me that I needed. She also mentioned a group called La Leche League, which is a breastfeeding peer support group that I'm a part of. And at the time, I didn't have the transportation to get to a meeting or the means at that time to try to figure that out. But I kind of held on to that name in my brain somewhere. And so it would come back up later, but she really set the precedent for me because I had nobody else there giving me any tidbits of information about breastfeeding. And it was it was it was really a blessing for me. I would say on the next slide we'll talk about how I and this is a funny picture that I use because it is actually an incident that happened. I didn't have any physical issues with breastfeeding. We were off to a good start, and he actually co-slept with me. And breastfeeding as a single mom made it really, really easy for me, where I could get enough sleep through the night, where because I didn't have anybody helping me get up in the middle of the night, it helped me to be able to soothe my baby. And it was kind of a lifesaver in a sense. Um, we didn't have physical problems, but there were some incidents that happened. My son refused to take a bottle. And that was really scary because at the time I had gone back to school and he would not drink out of a bottle all day long. And so his father was very nervous. I was very nervous. And I kind of came up with a solution. I found a sippy cup that had a silicone nipple on it, and that worked. And so it was like a breath of fresh air. But I didn't know that that was something that babies or exclusively breastfed babies did. And so it was a kind of scary time because you're always afraid, what if my baby isn't getting what they need? I figured that out. And then I also had to deal with the scrutiny from my family members. And I think a lot of people who choose to breastfeed can attest to having some sort of experience around people not being accepting of you breastfeeding, especially if it's publicly, whether you're covered or not. And in this photo here, I was out at lunch with my family members, and I had one very outspoken auntie who did not like that I breastfed publicly. And I would try to cover up, and he would snatch the cover off of him. And he would be sweating. So I felt so bad for my baby because he was hot. He did not like it. And so eventually I just had to go with what worked for him. And so I would breastfeed where we are. And I would try to be discreet. And my aunt did not like it. And so in this picture, she actually had told me to go to the restroom. Well, why don't you just go to the restroom and feed him there? And I remember thinking, this sounds absurd. Why would I take my baby in a nasty restroom to feed him where there's no seats, there's no area to nurse my baby, and we're about to sit down and eat and have dinner? Why can't my baby just eat? And it just seemed like the next best thing. And so she had a lot to say during my entire time nursing, and she absolutely grew from the experience that we had. Um, by the time that I had subsequent kids, she didn't even bat an eye. And I remember asking her about it because she was so uh, vocal about me breastfeeding publicly. And she wasn't phased anymore. She was like, oh, it's just normal. And it made me kind of feel happy because it was a feeling of, I have normalized breastfeeding to someone who is not only close to me and dear to me, but this is a tough critic, and this is a tough person to get on your side. And so it really made me feel better that I had done the right thing, that my family supported me a little bit more at this time. And so I always tell people that breastfeeding for me has a special place in my life. It helped me through postpartum depression. It helped me through really to find my purpose in life, because I had many visions of what I thought I wanted to do. And every turnaround, I kind of got brought back to breastfeeding in some shape or fashion. And at this stage, when my son was probably maybe around 6 months old in this picture, I didn't even know that I could do anything related to breastfeeding. I didn't know that there were career options surrounding that. And so that was a really big part of my life. It was a really trying time in my life. And so getting through this, I really credit breastfeeding a lot for helping me. And then in the next slide, I talk about where I am now in my life, which is I have had 3 more babies, and I have successfully breastfed all 3 kids. And as you can see, we breastfeed everywhere. It is just a part of our lives. It is a part of our home. And my kids are not only educated on it, but to them, it is just a normal part of life. And some pictures that I couldn't find were my son trying to breastfeed his newborn baby sister because she was crying, and just seeing how it's affected them in such a positive way. And I look at, again, how my whole family is so supportive. And when I have had cousins who've had babies, they have turned to me for breastfeeding advice. They have turned to me when they needed extra milk. And so these were things that really made me so happy, because I know statistically that Black women are less likely to breastfeed, and they're less likely to extend breastfeeding. And so seeing it on a basis in my own family was really pleasing to me in my heart. It just was like, okay, this is what I want to do with my life. And so in the next slide, I talk about the purpose that I found with breastfeeding. And the purpose for me started with going to my first La Leche League meeting after I had moved and had my second child. And I'm now a stay-at-home mom, and I have the ability to go to a meeting. And I go to a meeting and I go to a conference, and I am surrounded by all of these women who are breastfeeding. And I have never been around so many people who breastfed. And I felt accepted. I felt invited. And it was such a pivotal time for me that I think showed me that there are different avenues I can go about helping people. And so I joined La Leche League, and then the pandemic happened right after I became a leader. And so I couldn't host any in-person meetings, but I did try to host some virtual meetings. And then I joined the board of directors, or the council, for La Leche League USA. And so I have started to work more on that end, on the back end of it. And that has led to me starting a nonprofit called Nourish and Thrive, which aims to create breastfeeding equity for Black women or Black birthing people. And it is something that is so fulfilling. And when I tell people about it, I actually get really excited about it because this is something that I would love to be my legacy. I would love for people to remember me because of the work that I've done in helping my community. And again, I never thought that any of this was possible, but it all started with breastfeeding. It all started with this love for breastfeeding that came from I don't know where, but it has always been a part of my heart. And it's a part of my identity. And I am so grateful that I've been able to breastfeed because I know that it isn't always something that is as feasible for some people, depending on their situations. And I know that it isn't something that may be accessible, even though it seems like the most accessible thing to do. So I am grateful, and I feel like my children and my breastfeeding journey is a part of my identity. It's a part of my story for myself as an individual.